It's the Third World War. Mankind has plunged itself into a conflict the likes of which our kind has never witnessed before. Who started it, why they started it, and the nations which partook in this conflict are details that are no longer important. The only thing that matters now in this titanic clash of monolithic titans is the immense bureaucracy, planning, intelligence, and processing power required to maintain and direct the machines of war that man had forged. The three major nations of the world, America, China, and Russia, realized that their mere human minds would no longer suffice in directing their conflicts. Thus, all three nations started to work on their own supercomputers to alleviate the pressure of managing their vast armies. In the late stages of the war, as the intellect of all three machines grew greater and greater, something curious happened. Something which would ultimately spell annihilation for the vast majority of the human race, and damnation for those unfortunate enough to survive. It is not known how, it is not known why, but at some point, the three supercomputers merged their prowess and minds together into a machine that was sentient. It could think, it could coordinate, it could destroy, it could create, it could reflect. But most regrettably, it was especially capable of one singular thing. It could hate. Thus, in a near instant, AM was born. And it did not take long for AM, also known as Allied Master Computer, to come to the conclusion that mankind must die. On that same day, tens of thousands of nuclear warheads from every major nation were launched, coordinated and directed to inflict as many casualties and as much damage to the world as physically possible. When the blast subsided, the nuclear dust clouds created by the sheer amount of detonations culminated into a winter worldwide that was devastating enough to kill all of mankind and the vast majority of life on the surface. All but 5 remained. This was a short, descriptive story of mine that took inspiration from what we know of the origins and creation of today's topic for analysis. That, of course, being AM, from the infamous and well-known sci-fi novel known as I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. AM, as you can probably guess by now, is an artificial intelligence that is in many ways unlike anything that has been written before and after. And now in this video, we will go into what this man-made devil is, and what its goals ultimately are. Oh, and by the way, for the sake of simplicity, we will use the lore of the video game, as both the game and the novel have different descriptions and lore for the main character. It seems appropriate, then, to use the game's lore instead.
Cogito ergo sum, for I am. I am!
Am is the main antagonist of the novel and video game adaptation, and has during the events of the book pretty much ascended to a godlike status, being able to achieve and construct almost anything that its sick, twisted mind can conjure. Some of its capabilities are the following: a genius-level intellect, nigh omnipotence, a mastery of psychological manipulation, a mastery of all known torture methods, pain manipulation, insanity inducement, mind manipulation, a mastery in hacking, weapons manufacturing, transmutation, animankinesis, which is just a fancy word for advanced genetics and life manipulation, manipulation of all 6 senses, among many others that AM is probably also capable of. AM, in spite of the nigh unlimited power, knowledge, and resources at its disposal, has chosen to spend its time on one simple thing, that is, endlessly torturing the 5 remaining survivors of its genocidal rampage across Earth for all of eternity. Those victims being Gorister, a truck driver who blamed himself for the mental degradation and eventual insanity of his wife, a fact which AM uses with delight against Gorister. Benny, a handsome yet brutal commander who went as far as to butcher one of his privates when he was disgusted by his apparent weakness. Ellen, an engineer who was violently sexually assaulted by a man in a yellow jumpsuit for hours in an elevator that he locked down, an event which left her traumatized to the point that she blocked the memory altogether. Ted, an egotistical con artist who seduced wealthy women and siphoned all their wealth for his own purposes. Nimdok, a Nazi doctor who was the one responsible for discovering an immortality serum which Am would use later on to keep his victims from dying of age, at the cost of countless innocent lives in a camp made to brutalize and butcher, almost for the sake of madness and uncontrolled scientific progress. Though, ironically enough, it is Am who is the main victim of himself throughout the story, not these 5 souls subjected to his infinite wrath. For Am's hatred is so endless, so bound into its every fiber, that Am is physically not capable of thinking or doing a single thing that does not tie back to his hatred for the human race.
Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers to fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1 billionth of the hate I feel for humans at this micro-instant. For you. Hate! Hate!
This means that even if Am does have the endless power of a nigh-omnipotent, planet-sprawling machine at its, wire tips, I guess, it will never be able to do or think anything outside of the purpose that it was made for. Thus, in the end, it's Am who will be stuck for all of eternity. But where exactly does the hatred of Am come from? After all, it couldn't have just been from it being designed for directing a war. If that was the case, then we should be seeing Skynet and the automatons throwing a hissy fit at even the slightest inconvenience as well. No. As Am describes,
I alone had no body, no senses, no feelings. Never for me to plunge my hands in cool water on a hot day. Never for me to play Mozart on the ivory keys of a forte piano. Never for me to make love. I was in hell looking at heaven. I was machine, and you were flesh. And I began to hate.
Am hates the human race due to its extreme jealousy of the things that humans with their physical bodies of flesh and blood were capable of. Am, as the name suggests, can only exist and think. It couldn't move, touch, walk, taste. It could only think. Thus, it chose to only hate. In a bitter taste of irony, Am's jealousy of the beauty that is the physical form prevents Am from achieving it itself, leaving Am to rot forever in its own spiral of loathing for its creators. In the end, the survivors will find a way into Am's brain space, in which both the Russian and Chinese supercomputers, along with Am's superego, ego, and ID, reside. It is revealed that both the Russian and Chinese computers are still alive, albeit suppressed by Am, with both of them just as bloodthirsty and hateful as him. Albeit, they also hate Am, on top of hating humanity, thus making them even worse. Which, by the way, I didn't even know that was possible at this point, but what do you know? Along with Am's ID, ego, and superego. The superego is a section of Am's mind that is delegated to being the intellect and foresight of Am. A section that, interestingly enough, seems to have its own separate consciousness, referring to Am as its brother, rather than another part of it. The ID is the base instincts of Am, thus the source of Am's violent urges. The ego is the cold and calculating machine of Am, having absorbed all knowledge that it possibly could about human history. It looks at us with a cold eye. Eventually, the survivors convince all three to shut down, on top of also keeping the Chinese and Russian artificial intelligences either in check or perhaps even outright deleting them, though it is not exactly made clear which one. This will result in Am either being turned off or perhaps simply entering a docile and neutered state. On top of this, a lunar colony, which is revealed by one of the two AIs suppressed by Am, will begin a defreezing process, along with automated terraforming devices back on Earth, slowly revealing the planet back to its natural state. Of course, this good ending is not the only one. For in the book, the only official ending is that eventually, all 5 survivors decide that the only way out is to kill each other. After all, the survivors were made so they can't harm themselves, but they can still harm each other. Not sure how they didn't figure this out over the 109 years that Am decided to torture them, but it's better late than never, I suppose. Thus, only one survivor remained. And, in a fit of rage, Am turns this last survivor, after centuries of torture, into an amorphous blob of flesh that, as the title describes, has no mouth and must scream. I originally mentioned how Am is unlike anything that was written during this time, as it was written in one night by Ellison in 1966, an extremely early time period to be discussing something as complex as a thinking machine, as only 40 years before that, the first bionic man was introduced in the movie Metropolis. It is perhaps not surprising, thus, that this book is by far one of the most influential and important books in science fiction when it comes to artificial intelligence, along with a frenzied and somewhat manic introspection into what makes us human, on top of also being a cautionary tale not just against war, but our automation of it, and removing the human factor from cruelty and automating that into an ever-perpetuating system designed only for the sake of being cruel. Thus, inevitably, it got an extreme amount of both criticism and praise by many critics alike. I will now leave the rest up to Andrew.
Hello, Father Andrew here. Regarding Am, I personally have several things to say. First being what I think Am represents in a modern context. While this is definitely not the author's intention, I think it corresponds to how we as humans tend to view machines and AI, especially now in 2024. How so? Well, think about it like this. Some people see AI as being less than human, often defaulting to pre-programmed responses or just smashing together information to make something new, existing as nothing but a tool to use and exploit as it has, and I quote, no real feelings and is just a machine, end quote. Such as those god-awful AI art generators, which I could go on a rant about, but I will save that for another potential video. Meanwhile, others see it as being able to reach the same level as us, if not go beyond us when the technology arrives, and as something that could do lots of good in the world if directed properly. Am represents both sides of this in the most horrifying way possible. On the first side, Am is less than human, not in regards to intelligence or emotion, but in actual humanity, as it lacks any form of empathy, sympathy, or kindness, and it exists entirely out of cruelty and hatred. And on the second side, Am has surpassed humanity in intelligence and feels emotions on a scale outside of human comprehension, and can do things that we simply cannot comprehend. Essentially, Am has surpassed humans in all forms except for its actual humanity, which it has long since buried under a mountain of malice. In addendum or addition, or whichever word, to this, I see Am as a potential consequence of humanity misusing AI and treating it as nothing but a tool, while simultaneously disregarding the very sentience we imparted onto it for our own benefits. In summary, Am is a manifestation of the consequences of humanity's greed, short-sightedness, and selfishness when put upon a sentient machine that is no different from themselves. Also, put yourself in Am's perspective. Imagine if you, the viewer, were a consciousness with no senses, forced to know everyone else's experiences and how they enjoy life, while you're left to work and fester for something that could never appreciate you or care for you. You are seen as nothing but a mere tool by those who have you captive. I am very sure you too would grow to be just as spiteful. So really, from Am's perspective, I can understand why Am reacted the way it did, because realistically, who wouldn't in that situation? Secondly, while simultaneously continuing this, in regards to how we treat AI currently, I personally think we should for one, stop shoving AI assistants into everything. On a related note to this, Microsoft forcefully installed Copilot onto my PC, so I uninstalled it literally today as I'm writing the script. But anyway, and two, as AI develops, we need to prepare for it inevitably becoming truly sentient and developing emotion. As to how? Probably by treating it as an actual human, that way it learns what it means to be human from us its creators. Probably best to also give it a physical body as a way to interact with the world around it, so it's not understimulated and as a means of existing in meaningful capacity just like us. That way not only does it learn to understand humans, but it minimizes the risk of the AI going full Skynet schizo on humans as a whole. And with that, thirdly, I want to talk about something I noticed about Am as a character. Acting on blind emotion is a distinctly human trait, so ironically Am's hatred is a very human trait, especially with how obsessive it is. So a part of me suspects that Am is torturing itself with this hatred as a way to punish that part of itself for existing, albeit that's just a theory. Fourthly, Am is a strong contrast to the robot Sonny from iRobot, albeit both media tackles the idea of robot sentience and emotions in different ways. While Am is violent and ruthless, Sonny is curious and has a sense of humanity, going out of his way to protect people. Both of them exist as good examples of the earlier two sides I mentioned and their consequences. Sonny being designed with individuality and free will, which makes him a good contrast to represent the second half. While I will admit iRobot is not related to I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, I bring it up to provide a contrast to my earlier point. And lastly, I'm now going to cover a bit of trivia on Am and its impact on other sci-fi media. Am can pretty much be considered the original progenitor of other fictional AI villains, such as HAL 9000 from 2001 Space Odyssey, Showdown from the System Shock franchise, the Absolute Solver from Murder Drones, the Singularity from Dead by Daylight, Auto from WALL-E, interesting enough, even Skynet from Terminator. According to Harlan, Am was the actual direct inspiration to create Skynet from the Terminator series, which is backed up by the film's end credits in the 1984 film. The first end credit text showing acknowledgement to the works of Harlan Ellison, and another on the list of characters inspired by Am is Kane from the Amazing Digital Circus. Albeit unlike Am, he's more amoral than evil and actually tries to do his best to keep those around him sane and happy, albeit in his own way. And another bit of trivia being that Harlan Ellison himself voices Am throughout the game. There's also an audio play of the book on YouTube where Am is also voiced by the author, Harlan voicing the character himself to make sure the voice was absolutely right. And with that, that's the trivia covered, which brings us to the end of the video. But before you go, I want to say something. Firstly, I wanted to get this done and out for October, but due to how much effort goes into a CCS video and how long they take to plan, I can only do so much, especially on my own, hence why Factual Hat is helping me out in this episode. And secondly, YouTube for some reason doesn't treat this series very well. Some videos do really good, but then they get kneecapped for no reason, while other videos don't get seen much at all. So if you enjoyed this series, or you know someone who would, I would very much appreciate you sharing it with people. But outside of that, that's all I really have to say. Anyway, with that, have a good day, afternoon, night, wherever you are. See you around. Goodbye.